Why don't you tell me in the comments, like, how is capitalism influencing your mental health? Tell me all about it. Um, because I really think like it affects all of us so differently depending on like our experiences and our identities. But it is not good for any of us. So do tell me below, um, how is capitalism influencing your mental health? Okay, so why is a counselor such as myself making a video about capitalism? Why do you think? That's a rhetorical question. The reason that this is important is because capitalism is heavily influencing our mental health. Our mental health is not just a product of our biology or our thoughts or feelings. It is a product of our lived environment. And more than anything else, capitalism defines our lived environment. Um, Capitalism is not just an economic system. I think that there's this idea that it's just an economic system, and I think that obscures all the other things that it is. It's a moral system, an ethical system, in the sense that it comes with the set of like ideological tenets around things like individualism, competition, um, looking out for your friends, but not for the greater society. Things like nepotism is, I think, part of capitalism. Um, Extraction, like extracting from the natural world and like not so much paying attention to the consequences. Um, Also, it's heavily influential on like democratic processes because you have a lot of resources in a capitalist economy, you're able to influence elections or the lack thereof. Uh, there's a lot of history of how certain countries, and looking at the United States, have used their militaries to further the aims of corporations externally. So this is all part of capitalism, and you can imagine this has some implications for mental health. Thus, this is why it's important to talk about, as I'll be referencing capitalism in future videos, and it's important that we're on the same page about it. Lots of other people have written, talked about the influence of capitalism on mental health. You know, I would encourage you, if you're interested, to engage in further resources about this. I'm certainly not the first, but I think it's important for me to sort of establish a baseline so we're on the same page on my channel. So yeah, what are some of the effects on mental health? I'm going to talk about this much more towards the end of the video. There will be a link, there will be a table of contents in the description of this video. But yeah, here's a sneak peek. Here's a little bit of what to expect. Um, Number one, access to resources that we need. What happens when we don't have them? Obviously, our mental health is going to suffer. Number two, stress caused by work and overwork. That literally has a deleterious effect on our bodies and our capability to like heal from things that happen in our lives and elsewhere. And then there's the direct harm of capitalist systems, which there's so much to get into. I could do full videos on all of these different little things I'm bringing up. So this is intended to be more of an introductory. Um, but yeah, and I think also like relationships really suffer because people are viewed as disposable. So I think this sensation so many of us have of like feeling alone, of not having people we can really rely on or who care for us. That's heavily connected to capitalism, which encourages us to view people as products which we can toss when we are done with them, and to view ourselves in this way too. And this is not just like the fault of ideology, this is like social practices and institutions that reinforce this. So yeah, we'll talk much more about this. So just to know what to expect, prior to that, first I'll be getting into some of the historical origins of capitalism And then I'll be talking about some of the current and ongoing processes which have a big role in the continuation of capitalism. And then we will be connecting this to mental health. Ready? Here we go. Okay, so historical origins. So this for me, like I gain a lot of inspiration and knowledge, and I've been studying the work of Abdullah Öcalan, who's a Kurdish revolutionary. He has a few different books I've read called Manifesto for Democratic Civilization. So he is like historically he's looking and drawing like a understanding of like how did we get to be where we are, which is important in understanding like how do we build alternatives, and then he's building alternatives in this series of books. um, and then also influential for me is David Graeber's 5,000 Years of Debt, or Debt for 5,000 Years. He was an anarchist anthropologist who also was taking a long-term look at the concept of debt. This also has become like a pretty well-known book and work. I'll link to some further info in the description, maybe a YouTube talk. Um, and also this there is Manuel de Landa's 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. It's also been influential for me in just sort of charting out, like, over a long period of time, how certain things have influenced other things and just the importance. Because I think if we look at history in much smaller increments, we tend to lose sight of the larger patterns that are necessary. Because if you were to look at the last 100 years, you might think that capitalism has been around forever. If you look over the past 1,000 or 10,000 years, you would come to understand that this is not the case, right? And that there are many alternatives, and we don't need to live under capitalism. That's the most important takeaway in doing this history, is that this has not been around forever, and in fact, it won't be. Um, this is my perspective. Okay, so historical origins. So this is something that Öcalan writes about a lot. Um, I just dropped something. Um, he writes about how there were these markets in Sumer. Sumer was located in what we would now call the Middle East, or the Fertile Crescent. Um, Talking about how there were these like priests who sort of oversaw these markets, and this was a time before there were like complex political bureaucracies, and we were just sort of starting to see people starting to have like surplus. So like then there was markets to sort of like deal with that, the surplus, and like new professions. Um, so that's important, I think, like the introduction of markets. And then like um Akhlan talks about how like culture sort of spreads in this diffused way, and it doesn't people don't necessarily have to conquer other groups of people in order for like culture and like these innovations or changes to spread. So like markets sort of spread out from there. Um, I think also like he talked about markets in China, and how um, like China had this tradition of like, yeah, we have markets and we have like people who gain wealth from markets, but also um, they thought it as being very important to um, curtail the power of money. Like they were like, this is going to be bad if people have too much of it, so we're going to let people have it, but then we have to like hold them accountable. Um, and then also like Islamic merchants were like much more just in tune with like the working class than I think from like Western Europe merchants were. So yeah, there's like all these different traditions of markets that like don't even look like capitalism today. But that is like an important part of the lineage. Um, and the other piece I wanted to talk about is like the invention of like currency, and as like trade started to expand out. So David Graeber talks about how there's this like myth of like barter, like oh, like prior to capitalism, people like bartered. Like they said, oh, I have like this and you have that, so we'll just trade. And it was so inefficient that they were like, we have to have capitalism, we have to have money, we have to have markets. Um, and he's like, he did the research and he's like, that's not true. Actually, barter only tends to arise when um, people who are in a money system suddenly lose access to money, or like the money like it's just useless, and then people will like revert to barter, before then building an economy based on debt. So he talks about how a lot of markets were centered around debt, because people knew each other and people trusted that they would be able to pay their debts off, or like a lot of the time they would like write off like debt, if people fell on hard times, and that there was like cyclical like debt jubilees where all privately held like debt, so this would be people's debt and not corporations or companies' debt, was just removed by like the ruling class, because they were like, we don't want our peasants to get too uncomfortable because that would be very bad for us. Like they had an understanding, which some of our current governments could maybe learn from them, that if they left their people to be too poor, that they would revolt. So they would periodically just remove all debt. But yeah, so the economy centered around debt, and there was no like real sense of currency. And then he talks about how we sort of have these cycles of like no currency, or like virtual currency that's like debt, and then like physical currency that people like exchange. And an important part of where physical currency came from was paying militaries. So, and I think this is like the Roman Empire. So, um, yeah, so folks, like military generals who wanted to be able to feed their army as they like expanded out very far away. Like if you can imagine, those supply lines would be very difficult, and also like to be able to produce enough food and then to keep it going all these different directions. And it was easier to pay those militaries in a currency that local merchants would accept, so that they could supplement what they were receiving and go and get what they needed from those merchants. But they needed to force those merchants by force to accept that currency as legitimate. And so that was the role of the state, or, yeah, the state. I guess I should define the state. The state is interconnecting government apparatuses. It's like it's not just the government. It's like the state is like the entity around which there are the entity that is defined by its borders, that seeks to like fulfill its own desires, that is like sort of in alignment with the ruling class, and like sort of its own thing. Um yeah, I'm using state in the anarchist sense, not like, New York State, whatever. Um I hope that's clear. Let me know in the comments if that is not clear. Thank you. Um, So this was the role of the state. The state forced merchants to accept currency. And so it was useful in the sense that mercenaries and armies could buy what they needed. And this trickled in bit by bit into local economies, but it really wasn't in common use in a lot of local economies. Um, it was more so like, yeah, like currency is useful when you don't trust the person you're dealing with, or you're unlikely to interact with them in the future. A lot of these small communities, they still were using like debt. They would like tally up, this is how much of this, and you know, um, also the other connection of currencies was in long distance trade. So as trade routes got further and further out, um, that it was useful for there to be currency that could either be exchanged or directly accepted, so that you could deal with a merchant from far away, and then like the useful of like directly tallying up how much money this is and like how much I'm giving you like means our relationship is over, right? And I think David Graeber talks about how having a little bit of debt to your neighbor or to different people in your community means that you have an ongoing relationship with them. So he talks about how it was common in some communities for people always to be a little bit in debt to each other, and that was like, in a sense, a form of like relating. But so yeah, Currency over time came to be connected to like precious metals because that represented like just the pure distillation of value. Like if you know if you're minting a new currency, how do you ensure that someone far away will accept it? Well, part of that is because they can see like, oh, there's this metal, I could melt it down and reform it into my own currency. Like it has this amount of value, right? So, but it was not used in day-to-day transactions for the most part. Um, Skip forward a little bit. Um, the colonialist expansion projects of mostly Western Europe um, were one, funded by debt, and two, this like push um, for them to get these current like to get these metals was for there to be currency, and China was funding this through debt. Like they wanted to have these reserves for their own currency, which, funny enough, is exactly what they're still doing with the U.S. dollar. Um, but yeah, so the colonialist expansion projects they would never have been profitable if not for Chinese government and merchants buying or funding um, these endeavors, and a lot of these conquistadors or like what's the word for them? Colonizers. These colonizers were so cruel in part because they themselves were in debt and just had this like just really like desperate relationship where they just needed to like to get more and more and more, and like they were not seeing the indigenous people they met as people, right? So that's like tied to them being in debt, I think. And that's there was like examples stories of that in these books. Um, so um, the other important piece was the transition away from feudalism, and you'll hear why this is relevant in a second. This took place like sort of in the midst of the Black Plague in Western Europe. Um, so a lot of people died, and the Black Plague was active for quite a few years. So I think that there's like possibilities here for like parallels with coronavirus or COVID-19 because you know it's however many years now and might still be going on for a while. Like Black Plague was going on for a while too. But the thing was, enough people died um, that it became a really favorable economy for workers to move around. So rather than like a serf who's dependent on a feudal lord, you all of a sudden were like, oh, like I have a better deal over here. Like they're willing to pay me more because everyone is so desperate for laborers. So it really opened up the possibility of like people like choosing their work, like working in different places because, you know, serfs and peasants, like they had feudal lords because their feudal lords would meet their basic needs. Like they weren't always so cruel. I mean, sure, sometimes they were. Like they didn't have any accountability, so they had the license to be cruel. But yeah, a lot of the time it was like a symbiotic sort of relationship where people would work this land and then they would get enough off of it to survive. I'm sure you know you may have heard that peasant laborers had more time off than the average U.S. worker nowadays. So you know there were benefits to that, but there also were attempted revolts and revolutions at the same time. But so yeah, that's like the transition from feudalism to like a more overt like capitalism. And then there was this colonialist expansion. And now I'm going to skip forward in time because there's lots of interesting stuff that happens in between, but we are sort of I just wanted to like frame the beginning of capitalism as happening a few hundred years ago, but that its precedents were much further back. So we know sort of the history of what we're engaging in. I think it would just be a lot to say everything important up until the present. So, okay, what are some processes What are some processes that characterize capitalism in its current form? And then later, what are those connections to mental health? So, one process is the continuous accumulation of wealth and power. And this is intimately connected to another process, which is the continuous expansion into new markets. So, um, the way that the game or the way that capitalism is set up is, um, at no point is it encouraged for you to stop and to sort of say, like, I have enough. Um, we're going to be sustainable. Capitalism really does not rely on sustainability. It relies on continuously expansive exploitation. And to that end, people accrue wealth, wealth which is connected to power and political power specifically. And they use that wealth to go and get more wealth to secure their access to future wealth. Like it's like this cyclical thing. And in terms of connections to mental health, I mean, I'm sure you can imagine how like empty the emotional life of someone is who has a great deal of power, um, but they do it anyway. I think you could view that the continuous accumulation of wealth and power is addictive. I'm sure it is. Um, Maybe I'll talk more about that at some point, but I think it's important to think like this is why people do this. It's not because they are evil from birth, but it's because they're put into this situation of this is what's expected of them, and then it's addictive, so they keep doing it, and they don't have a stop button or this is enough button. Um, yeah, because that's just sort of how the system is set up is for continuous accumulation, continuous expansion, also exploitation, another process. Exploitation of natural resources and people, where does that money come from? Exploiting the natural resources, which are like, you know, should be everyone's, like, should not be property. But these resources are privatized and exploited to the greatest degree possible, so that people convert those essentially into power, and they exploit the people who are working for them so that they don't get the full value of what they're adding to the process of production. So it's very much like the continuous accumulation of wealth and power is connected to the exploitation of natural resources and of people and of the expansion into new markets. That's also expansion into new places to accumulate resources and people and thus exploit them. Um, Also, the other process that's connected to these things is to turn all necessities into commodities that you can profit from. That capitalists seek to profit from turning needs into commodities and um, creating desire and then turning these desires into commodities, like a lot of the things that are advertised to us today, and I know this because I was an advertising student for a while, and they'll tell you this directly. You have to create a desire where previously the consumer imagines that there is no desire. And part of the way that you do this is by making what them feel inadequate. This is the work of advertising and public relations and marketing, is turning everything into a commodity, including, water, food, housing, healthcare, human connection. Everything becomes a commodity that you can buy and sell and thus speculate on as an abstract separation from the thing itself. You speculate on it and you profit from it. That's their goal. And the last process, which I think I want to like say this is one of the most important. I mean, what is importance? They're all the thing. Um, the last one is cyclical collapse. So currently, the economy is shit. Um, People are struggling to meet their basic needs. In 2008, there was a famous collapse of the market at that time as well, in which the bankers were bailed out in the United States. I think in like Iceland, they hold them accountable. So good for you, Iceland. Um, I'll have a link to an article about that in my description. Um, but yeah, this also is like when you look at history over a long enough period of time, you see that because of this drive to turn everything into a commodity and then speculate on that commodity, then essentially these bubbles will always form in which people are speculating that a commodity is worth far more than people are actually capable of paying for it because these people who've accumulated so much wealth and power think that this is like endlessly going to keep multiplying in how much wealth they're extracting from this commodity. And there is an end at some point. You can't just continuously you know, stack the house of cards higher and higher and higher. Like eventually it does fall down. And so 2008 in the United States, there was a bubble that was mortgages and housing. Um, I'm certainly not an expert in that bubble, what caused it, but my understanding is it was basically like banks were selling mortgages to people who they knew could not afford them, and they packaged it in a certain like abstract way to make it look like it was a very like a good deal, and then they sold that debt to investors who then sold it off to other investors and so on and so on and so on. And the banks wanted to create more and more of these funds, and so they kept giving more and more loans to people who were less and less able to pay, while still being racist enough to deny loans to non-white people because even racism is sometimes more important than profit. Um, and eventually it just collapsed because people couldn't make those payments. And if you look now, housing again is a bubble because initial um, the initial issue of housing being a commodity was not resolved. Housing is still a commodity. And you look at like people my age, I'm in my mid 20s. People my age don't really expect to own a home for the most part. A lot of us are renting. A lot of us are spending an extremely high percentage of the money we bring in on housing. It's not sustainable. And there will be another collapse soon if one isn't already underway. I think sometimes you only can judge that sort of like after the fact, like, oh, this is when it started. Certainly, we're not in a good moment now economically. So, this idea of there is always going to be a cyclical collapse because there always will be bubbles in a capitalist economy because the economy like centers around these abstract commodities rather than the direct like people buying goods and services that they then immediately use or that they save for later use, but that it's like something that they plan on actually doing rather than reselling. Okay, so this also is the importance of alternative systems because if capitalism is um, constantly expanding into new markets, if it's about accumulating wealth and power, thus other people have less and less wealth and power in comparison, if it's about exploiting natural resources and people, then, and if it's all about cyclical collapse as well, um, what happens if we don't change if we don't change the global systems? What happens eventually? Well, we are in the midst of a great extinction event, and eventually we'll be included as people. And this is going to be the poorest people first, and then eventually the rich. But that's what's at stake. And okay, mental health effects. This is going to affect your mental health um, because of this like sense of impending doom, this lack of agency in these decisions of how capitalism is engaging with the world. Like a lot of people feel powerless. A lot of people are bearing the direct effects of these harmful decisions and these harmful processes. That's gonna affect your mental health. Like mental health, like I beg of you to think like where does mental health come from? Like it doesn't just like come from your brain. When you feel bad, it is connected to stuff that happens to you or things that you've been through or environments that you're in, or picking up on how other people are being treated as well. Um, Systems. I talk about how systems of oppression are trauma causing and reinforcing systems, and that is certainly true of capitalism. So, what, like, how, and people talk about healing from trauma and how you need the things that are causing the trauma to be resolved, or for you not to be actively being more traumatized for you to heal from that trauma. Well, capitalism is constantly traumatizing us. So in terms of like healing, you know, we can't see what healing beyond capitalism would look like until we move beyond capitalism. So I'm going to say that that's important. Um, but yeah, I got a little off track there. Let's get back to how does capitalism influence our mental health? Um, well, we lack access to our basic needs. Talking about housing being a commodity, um, everyone needs a home. In the United States, there are enough homes for everyone who is currently without a home. And people are spending so much money on their homes that they are unable to have other things that they either need or want. Um, you can imagine constantly being in fight or flight survival mode if you don't have access to your basic need of housing. And that's just housing. What about, um, food, water, medical care, um, you know, being loved and accepted by a community. This is also a basic need, but it's often like we're so focused on the other things that'll kill us if we don't get it that we don't think about like love as a basic need, but it is. Um, so capitalism commodifies our basic needs, and of course, this is going to affect our mental health. And that we have very limited capacity to change this broader system without us uniting together and dealing with it collectively. So I think it's important that, like, when I talk about how this is connected to mental health, that we think about like this is not a problem you can solve on your own. You have to connect with other people if you want to resolve some of these problems. Talk more about that in another video. But yeah, so in addition to lack of access to basic needs, specifically about relationships, this idea of like people being disposable, um, and it's connected to just this overbearing amount of work that we don't have the time to spend with people. It's connected to, the push to commodify all basic activities. So if we don't have all this money to spend, how are we going to spend time with people? Because we need money to spend time together because we spend all of our time consuming commodities. Well, um, imagine if imagine if people were not disposable. I think that would also entail like our things were not quite as disposable and our activities were not quite as disposable, but it would require us to be much more intentional about how we engage with the world and with each other. Then we could develop deeper relationships. Um, and that's not to say we can't do a lot of that without these broader changes. But I think this question of why am I so lonely, which is a very important question, which I will be returning to. Why am I so lonely? Why can't I build relationships? Why do I have social anxiety? Um, why do I feel like there's no one like me? These are very common things that I've experienced myself. Um, and it's because capitalism treats us like we're disposable. We end up treating other people that way because that's all we know how to do. And other people treat us that way too. And I think that there's like so much pressure on romantic relationships, on family relationships to save us from the disposability of relationships under capitalism. But that can only do so much. I think for people to be less disposable, we would need to genuinely be in community with each other, to genuinely be making decisions about things that affect all of our lives, and thus to have a real democracy, not a capitalist ruled democracy. Um, Also, work, just the amount of work we're required to do causes just so much stress. We don't have time to connect with people. We don't have time to rest. We don't have time to grieve. Grieving is so important. There will be a video about grieving. Um, Grieving the harmful things that have happened. We don't have time to stop and allow ourselves to feel upset because that would influence our productivity. We don't have time to community build, which like in an ideal system, community building would just be part of like engaging with the world. Like it would be as easy as like stepping outside and walking somewhere and then you're in community. Um, because here's the thing, like under capitalism, we can develop skills and we can be better or worse than each other at making connections with people, but it should not rely on our individual skill level. It should be as easy as like we're naturally developing relationships because we're just connecting around things that are meaningful to us. And we're resting, so we have time to build those relationships and deepen them. Okay. The last one, which is going to be very relevant, especially for people who are here for the therapy piece, in particular the counseling piece, um, is the pathologization process, because how we understand mental health is heavily influenced by capitalism as an ideology and as a moral and ethical system, in the sense that there's something not well with us, rather than correctly placing the blame on these processes, which I've identified earlier, and on the ideological apparatuses of capitalism, we are told that we're the problem. Oh, you're depressed. You just feel bad because there's something wrong with your brain. Or like, oh, like, you know, you're anxious, but I don't really know why you feel that way, even though, like, you're struggling to meet your basic needs. You're just anxious about, I don't know, your brain's just that way. Um, and that's to say nothing of like other, conditions as well, which I could get into more. But capitalism trains us to view ourselves as objects and to define ourselves as objects, and that these mental health labels are that it's like, oh, it's my fault. Because if it's my fault, at least I don't feel quite so powerless. Maybe I could do something if it's all my fault. Rather than, if we were to identify that this is the fault of these capitalist systems, that would require solidarity and organizing and overthrowing these systems, which capitalism is not going to help. I mean, they're not going to let us do that, or they're not going to want us to do that. It's not about if they let us or not. Um, but so the mainstream mental health pathologizes us and says we are sick, we are ill, diseased for expressing distress, for feeling distress um, in a profoundly stressful environment. To experience distress in a distressing environment, that's actually a healthy response. That shows that you are connected to your experience. I think that for the folks who are like claim to be doing really well, claim to be doing really great, like either they have a bunch of money to separate them from the problems of capitalism, and then they're willfully not looking at how that's affecting other people, and or they're like deeply in denial of their pain. Um, so I think it's often like those of us who are suffering the most who are most cognizant of the world, what's really going on. Um, there's this quote, I think the name of the person who said this was Yuji Krishnamurti. Um, I think it's something like to be well in a sick society. I don't remember this exact quote. I'm gonna put it in the description later. It is no sign of wellness to be well in a sick society. Something like this. Um, I really believe that. I really think um, so many of us are not doing well, and it is because we're in touch with what's going on. It doesn't make you feel good. Um, so the important piece is that mental health itself is a grounds for like discourse and like discursive battles of like, oh, this is because there's something wrong with you versus no, like I'm feeling distress and it's because of these systems and this is what I'm going to do about it. And that's more so the perspective I'm coming from with this channel. So I do hope like we can come to some alternate understandings. Um, I'll say another quote. Gil Scott Heron, who was a I think Harlem poet during the 1960s, he wrote, "The revolution will not be televised." And I think that that is really about like the revolution of like in here, like seeing that it's not us which is the problem, having hope for the future, connecting, building relationships with the people around us, and doing like wanting to do something. That's the revolution. And it won't be televised because it happens internally and externally in relationships and it happens slowly. It's not like a dramatic, like, you storm the White House. If that does happen, the revolution will have already been well underway for many years. Um, so the revolution will not be televised. Um, maybe maybe this channel will help get us there. We'll see. I don't know. Um, why don't you I feel like this has been going on for a while. Um, why don't you tell me in the comments, like, how is capitalism influencing your mental health? Tell me all about it. Um, because I really think like it affects all of us so differently depending on like our experiences and our identities. But it is not good for any of us. So do tell me below, um, how is capitalism influencing your mental health? And if you like this video, if you want to see more of what I'm up to, please like this video and click subscribe. And consider joining my Patreon, where I will post outlines of my videos the week before they're released, and you get to support me making more of these videos, and that would be very nice. Um, that's all for today. Bye bye.